weight his confidence based on the priors that he has access to in each thing. So rather than saying this thing has been falsified or this thing has been confirmed, he weights a confidence on different aspects of the different testing groups. So for example, he has a 90% confidence probability that something has been falsified based on the metadata, and or 90 or 70% confidence rating that something else has been confirmed, and then you move forward with it.
So it's not quite as distinct and on the ground in the lab sort of work as it is in the philosophy.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Questions? Anything you didn't understand, something that wasn't clear, it's okay.
What are the ramifications of the anti-realist and the realist? Because in my opinion, it doesn't really seem to change anything about science. It just
Right,
changes our view.
that's actually a good point. Realism versus anti-realism doesn't actually change anything. It's just it's a philosophy of science position on what science is. Is it an approximation of reality or is it not? It's just a meta discussion. It doesn't have that many practical ramifications because the anti-realist simply says science is practical, it works, but it doesn't actually map onto reality, is what the anti-realist says, as far as I know.
Well, this is more of a point I want to make than an actual question, but Caleb, have you read about Nate Silver? I'm sure for some people this is pretty much beating a dead horse, but what I find really interesting is that the individual political polls they did in the 2012 election, they were unreliable. But when people started doing a poll of polls, basically taking the polls together, they eliminated a lot of the error. And Nate Silver in particular got an exact electoral vote count. I think it was the April before the election, wasn't it?
Yeah. He basically did a meta-analysis of polls, is what he did, which is one of our primary statistical tools that we use in order to examine the results of the results, basically. So yeah, that's very much what he did. And the outcome is basically amazing.
I was trying to make sure I understand. You said they put all the polls together from the previous April, and they predicted the vote count in November. Is that what this
Yeah.
said?
Yeah.
They assign different weights to the polls depending on their accuracy, and by assigning different weights to different polls and just putting them together, they were able. Nate Silver was able to predict the exact electoral vote count. There were 2 states that flipped from what he was expecting, but because in one of those states a single delegate broke off, the electoral count was still exact.
You're talking about the 2008 election? Or?
2012. Nate Silver ran a poll of a meta-analysis of the polls that had been run before April, and he got really good results. I mean, even after Obama flopped during the first debate, he still held very fast to his electoral vote count.
And it's things like that that are the reason why any one, for example, scientific study is not necessarily considered groundbreaking and the end-all be-all of anything. What you have to do is you have to take the cumulative results of that field and examine them. Because what you do by doing that is you eliminate error sources more and more of them.
Yeah, because one study may have errors in the way they measure results, but when studies keep producing the same result, it's generally a pretty reliable estimate.
Right, to reiterate the point that was just made, science is not a series of magic moments. You wait for the next magic moment to happen. Most of science is hard in the trenches, step-by-step work from series of studies, from studies of studies. Some of the best things I've personally read were papers analyzing other papers that helped you understand the methodological process used, the kinds of controls used in a specific study. And it's this step-by-step march that is what the real nature of science is. Science isn't inventing a new technology tomorrow. It's 100 people, 100 separate experiments converging together and demonstrating an overall conceptual trend in some area. thank you.
A little bit?
Just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. It's your opinion about other scientists' opinions, right? So meta. There's a certain percentage of scientists that are theists, right? Like guys like Francis Collins and even Isaac Newton, right? So if you were to like take Isaac Newton and transport him to modern day and get him in on the realist versus anti-realist debate, where do you, in your opinion, do you think that they would consistently fall as anti-realist or realist, or would it be just a random distribution? Do you think that that kind of mindset affects your philosophy of science? And this is for that smaller percentage of scientists that are also theists or religious.
Well, I'm not. It's kind of hard to model what Isaac Newton as the kind of theist he was, because he wasn't an evangelical by any means. He denied the divinity of Christ, but it's kind of hard to model what he would think if he was transported here today. But what's interesting, before I comment on that, it's interesting to note there's a small-time mathematician who is aware of the Bayesian equation, and he criticized some of Newton's conclusions using that equation. But anyways, I think that Newton would immediately, as anyone would, disagree with certain conclusions about statements people make. But I think I think he cared about history and stuff, because he published his own personal opinion on the historicity of Christ and stuff. I think he would read modern historians' works, and he would end up walking the same cognitive line many modern scientists have, and I would be surprised if he didn't give up his theism and recognize. I just think his opinion and position were more or less a result of his A and H. Is there anything else that you mentioned?
Man, I just wanted your opinion on the matter. That was actually my favorite part of your entire talk, so I was just like, do you think that affects where they would fall in that line?
Did you have a question?
I did. I had a question about the Bayesian probability. I'm sort of curious where the priors come from. If you're going to have an analysis, how are you going to identify the priors? Is there any kind of structure or methodology to do it?
May I ask you to answer that one?
Sure. So your priors come from previous research. So if for example, use the swan example that I used several times. If I've observed 1,000 swans and they've all been white, then that's one of my priors. How certain am I? Well, if I know that the swan population as a whole is 1,002, and I've seen 1,000 of them and they've all been white, then all of a sudden I'm pretty confident in that assumption that all swans are white. If I know the swan population is 4.3 billion, and I've seen 1,000, then all of a sudden I'm not quite as sure, because there's a whole lot more flexibility there in my sampling. Particularly if, for example, if it's all been swans on campus or something. So your priors all come from previous research, and then you put them together. So, just to give you an example, we published a pretty cool article a few years ago about quality of life and obsessive compulsive disorder. So in order to establish our hypotheses, we looked at prior research. What would our hypothesis be? Well, that it would be certainly lower than normal non-OCD patients. How would it compare to other anxiety disorders? Well, we had prior information that looked at quality of life and other anxiety disorders. So those are our priors. And so then we were able to put that together. Okay, well, I'm this percent confident that it will be lower than normal population. I'm this percent confident that it will be equal to other anxiety disorders. I'm this percent confident it will be higher than severe schizophrenia or whatever it would happen to be. So you put all this together, and that gives you sort of an outcome. Maybe I'm this percent Bayesian, 75% sure that it will be, the quality of life will be below this degree on a certain measure. Or if I'm launching a rocket to the moon. So I'm launching here to there. We know these physical attributes of thrust and velocity and mass, and those are our sort chance this is going to happen. Or if, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the doctor before. Your doctor is basically operating on Bayesian statistics when he says, here's your symptoms. Right? You have X symptom and Y symptom. Okay, well, those generally predict that you have this disease. And so he's basically operating from these prior assumptions or priors of, here's these pieces of information that I have. Their most likely assumption then is that you have this. So that's kind of, their top, here's the symptoms that predict these diseases. Does that make sense? So that's just a couple of examples.
I've definitely heard, talking to religious people, these sorts of arguments where most cultures have a religion, most people are religious, therefore there's something there. Or most people believe in God, therefore there must be a God. So what would be your counter as an atheist to those?
To what?
To the same thing, probability, that if most people believe in a God, or if there is religion.
Okay, the question is, what would my position or response as an atheist be to a religious person who says, most people believe in some kind of God, therefore I should too?
Therefore there must be
Oh,
some type of God.
Therefore there must be something that warrants that kind of belief.
Yeah.
Okay, personally, in those kinds of questions, I have I don't know, I guess I call it my inner evil scientist, in the sense that I would say, well, then I would believe that most people believe that there's some kind of God, full stop. And I would say all that data does is show us that most people believe in a God. It doesn't tell us why, it doesn't tell us anything about God, it doesn't tell us if there is a God. All it tells us is that most people believe in God, full stop. What if a small number of people believe in God? What doesn't matter what number of people believe in God? For all I know, there's a phenomenon that every human being experiences in the brain at, say, 5 years old that makes them feel that there's a God. Maybe their brain, their self, their internal monologue disassociates and mirrors and talks to them, and they believe it's an angel or some kind of deity. Maybe, hypothetically, let's say that happens to every 5-year-old, except me for some reason. I would then say to this religious person, that is more likely that is a simpler and more likely explanation to that phenomenon of people believing in gods than an actual non-natural meta-existence. Just in terms of likelihoods, there are millions of simpler explanations for why people would believe, or most people would believe in a God. I would just simply say, most people believing in a God is a description of fact. Most people believe in a God. That's it, full stop. It doesn't tell you anything more than that. And that's what I would say. Basically, what philosophy and science does to you, if you take it seriously, is you have to admit that you know very little. To put it this way, like, our genome is 2% different than the chimpanzees. Yet we are the only self-aware species that we know of that has begun to consider the nature of its own existence in the past 6,000 years. And for the 80,000 years before the past 6,000 years, we were basically dying in our 20s due to rotten teeth. But anyways, so if we are more intelligent than chimpanzees, and we're the first species to gain this kind of intelligence, there's no reason for us to assume that what we know is anything special. We're the first version. Like, no one would think today that punch card computers or an abacus is a good tool to use in market statistics. It's not a good thing. It's version 1.0. I would say that my knowledge is weak, and most people believing in a God, that being a fact, is a fact about those people, not a fact about God. That's what my response would be.
That wouldn't be, we're talking about the priors, that wouldn't be a prior. Like, that's an assumption, not actually a piece of verifiable data.
Yeah, it's
It's actually a
That's what-
logic
that's what
fallacy.
priors are. Yeah.
It's actually a logic fallacy called argumentum ad populum.
Okay, as Caleb said, that statement alone isn't a prior, Bayesian prior. It is just a statement, and you would have to actually conduct significant research. But if you turned it, even if you turned it into a fact, I was going with the hypothetical. But yes, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. The woman I'm pointing to right there.
You said in your experiment that you basically would throw it out if you couldn't falsify it. So my question would be, if you're collecting all this data and having all this information, and someone says, well, you can't disprove my theory, you can't falsify it, and they're not throwing theirs out, how would you respond to that? I don't know if that's a clear way to
That is really the core question in demarcation. What is the science and what is not science? Popper coined the falsification and formalized falsification because he wanted to try to solve that. If you can't falsify something, according to Popper, it's not a scientific statement. How would you, an example, say someone believes in an extreme, the first response would be, that's not a scientific statement. How do you want to, I would ask my conversation partner, my interlocutor, I would ask them, how do you want to proceed from there? It's not a scientific statement, I can't prove you wrong, where do you want to go? How do I know if it's right or wrong if it can't even conceivably be wrong? And then I might construct a case of where something that we know is true, and it's something that everybody believes, and I can show there's a way for that to be wrong. That's why you can have confidence in it or whatever. Basically, I would try to convince them that falsification is a good idea. That didn't work. I would simply say, we're at a kind of philosophical, conversational impasse. That type of thing, because that's where I would go in that kind of conversation.
Is it equally acceptable to extend a positive or a negative proposition? For example, the proposition there is a God is notoriously difficult to falsify, but the proposition there is no God seems as if it would be simple to falsify just by producing God. It seems as if those should be equally difficult to falsify. And what's my flaw in thinking for supposing that they're not equally difficult to falsify?
My hearing is not that well, but so you can correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say, what about negative propositions?
Yes.
And falsifying them, as I believe you said, what if the proposition there is no God, can that be falsified, or?
Notoriously difficult to falsify the proposition that there is a God, but it seems as if it would be easy to falsify the proposition there is no God just by producing God.
Okay.
Whereas on the first one, you'd have to sit through the entire universe and not find God.
So you're saying, to quote you, you're saying the proposition there is a God might be difficult to falsify,
They seem
but the
unequally
proposition there is no God would be easy to falsify by producing one?
It seems as if they're unequally falsifiable, and I'm sure that's some flaw in my thinking, but I can't articulate what that is.
The main way that most scientists work with their hypotheses is they attempt to falsify. So you're not attempting to find what you're looking for, you're attempting to falsify it. So if I was trying to look at the swans, for example, as a scientist, I wouldn't say, I'm going to look and see if there are white swans. I would say, I'm going to see if there are non-white swans. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yes.
And that's a scientific mindset in terms of I'm trying to disprove my hypothesis rather than trying to prove it, because you can very easily find support for your hypotheses, regardless of what they are. But if you look for the non-support and you don't find it, then that gives you much more confidence that your hypothesis is actually true. Does that make sense?
I think so.
But that's what we as scientists actually have to do, because it's much too easy to cherry pick the data and find what it is that you want. So you have to look for what it is you don't want.
gentleman in the purple shirt.
Kind of what you were saying on the falsifiability of how if something's not falsifiable or if something's not falsifiable, you can throw it out. A lot of times that's kind of the argument that comes from anti-realists, because I kind of, am kind of in the same mindset as you, I think. But you can't there's no falsifiability in reality. So the argument that, I get from a lot of, that kind of are in that mindset is how can you prove to me that reality is what it is? There's no falsifiability in reality. There's no way to say, and it kind of gets into this deep, kind of paradox of, our existence. But there's no way to falsify reality. There's no way to falsify. We don't have anything to base that off of. So and I didn't start thinking about it because I've always been in the kind of same mindset that you, kind of anti-realist or, science is what I, go by. But there's no way to falsify that. There's no way to falsify that what we know is incorrect or correct. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm just kind of.
If I've understood you, I believe you're saying that for a given model of reality, a given theory of everything, there's no way to falsify that? Or?
Yeah, so that's what kind of with the anti-realist base is there's no way, we don't know that that's correct. We know now, there's a way to falsify the shape of the earth, but there's no way to falsify that the earth is there. There's no way to falsify that we're not a part of, a mass computer or an imagination. That's kind of where the
science
anti-realist base
doesn't
gets.
directly deal with the fundamental nature of reality because we don't know what that is yet. Can't falsify what we don't know. If I'm not misunderstanding you, I would say that we can falsify models. That's all science is. We construct conceptual models to predict reality. And whether or not a particular conceptual model is scientific depends on whether or not it's conceivably possible to prove it false. The conceptual model that the surface of the Earth has some curvature, there are experiments you can perform to prove that false, or not to prove, but to demonstrate with high confidence that's false. Since and therefore the claim that the Earth has a curved surface, that hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis according to Popper because it can be falsified. Similarly, the claim that the Earth is flat is also a potential scientific hypothesis because there are ways to demonstrate it wrong. You would say that you have a low confidence in that due to certain kinds of experiments that you can conduct, sure, but the hypothesis itself is a potential avenue of pursuit in science, and it was pursued and demonstrated to be false. Now, about the fundamental nature, say if reality as we know it is a simulation, that would be a claim or a model. The only way a way to make that to falsify that. That's a good question. If reality is not a simulation, I don't see how you could falsify that. You could demonstrate that reality is a simulation if the people controlling the simulation, modified it in some communicable way, or if you were a brain in a vat and they installed you in a body and showed you the simulation. But there's no, I'm not sure how you could falsify that. If reality is a simulation and the people controlling the simulation, if there are entities controlling it, won't communicate with us, I don't see how you could prove that false. If you're a brain in a vat, can you falsify being a brain in a
Because
vat?
basically you're talking about being able to falsify whether your observations are correct or not. And all experiments or anything that you would do would be based on, again, observations. So we
Right.
end up trying to
And
verify
Popper would
what
say
you're trying to
those
verify.
claims aren't scientific because they can't be falsified. They're not in the domain of science, those are in the domain of astrology. The man in the red coat shirt.